How about something from the Splinter File? Ah, yes, the Splinter File. This year's elections, their history. The powerful influence from major financial backers would remain a mystery if it weren't for websites such as factcheck.org. That's where you can find a list of contributors whose strength will affect this country's politics for years to come. At that website, there are names of some of the cash cow groups, such as the 60 Plus Association, American Action Network, American Crossroads, American Future Fund, Americans for Job Security, Americans for Prosperity, Commission on Hope, Growth, and Opportunity. The names go on. And yes, there's the Tea Party Express. By now you've surely realized they're all conservative and Republican groups. Amazingly, there's something in common with cockroaches. That's right, all of them lean to the right. Researchers found that no matter what, when given the choice, the bugs showed a preference and went to the right when faced by a dead-end Y. Imagine that. I'm not making this up, folks. As freaky as it may sound, it's a matter of fact that cockroaches and conservatives favor the right. I'm not making a judgment here. This is simply the course of nature, as documented in the Journal of Insect Behavior. So my question to you, do you suppose cockroaches would have something to say on creationism as well, and that we might be able to learn from that perspective? Just a thought, folks. Just a thought. Well, as I said, good morning. My name is Raul Gallio, and this is Pleasures in Taste. Open the book, Keys to Good Cooking, to most any page, and I'll bet you'll learn something. That's no surprise. After all, it's written by a science writer and food and cooking educator, I might say. If not, if I'm wrong, we'll find out. Today, Harold McGee, Keys to Good Cooking on Pleasures in Taste. Harold, and thank you so much for joining us today on Pleasures in Taste.
Good morning, Raoul. It's my pleasure.
And I think it's best for you to describe your book, because this is not a cookbook. And go ahead.
That's right. It's a book that is intended as a companion to cookbooks, so there aren't any recipes in it. What there are pieces of information about ingredients and about techniques and about recipes, so that when you're in the kitchen and a question comes up, either when you're picking a recipe or when you're trying to adapt it to your own kitchen, you can take a look in this book, find the answer to that question, and then put the book away and get right back to cooking.
I don't have your book in front of me. Is there one chapter that you feel is least understood or most misunderstood based on your research?
Well, my feeling is that meat and fish are the hardest things to get just right. And the reason for that is that they're protein foods, and proteins are very sensitive to heat. In vegetables, which are mostly carbohydrates are not that sensitive. We just kind of boil them till they're done. There are other ways to do it, but that's a very simple and good one. In the case of meats, because proteins are so sensitive to heat, it takes a little more care to get them just right. And there are all kinds of mythologies about cooking meat that you still find repeated on TV shows and in magazines and books. Things like searing a piece of meat at a high temperature to begin with will seal in its juices and guarantee you a succulent, result, or cooking in a moist environment like a braise will guarantee you a good result. Those things just aren't true.
Well, let's take this searing. Why doesn't that lock in the juices? Because we've got everything just kind of creating a seal, don't we? It would seem.
Well, it sounds plausible, but if you do the simple experiment of searing whatever, pork chop or a steak, and then cook it just right, and then put it on a plate and watch it, what you'll see happen is all these really appetizing juices will begin to seep through the top surface and to pool underneath the piece of meat, and that's in fact how you know that you've done it just right, is that the juices are coming out rather than staying in. So I think the person who came up with that theory, who was a chemist, by the way, not a cook, was thinking of maybe cautery or something like that, where you seal up a wound by using very high heat. But in the case of cooking meat, it just doesn't work.
It kind of amazes me, because I will confess that I recall reading the section on meat, and there was the idea, okay, if you want a gorgeous turkey for Thanksgiving, keep it whole. If you want taste, cut it up. And so I did, had it cut up.
Uh-huh.
And there was no problem at the different temperature requirements of the wings, the legs, the dark meat versus the white meat.
Uh-huh, uh-huh. Yeah, the turkeys, birds in particular, are a real challenge because they have two different kinds of meat, and they require two different kinds of temperatures, and they're on the same bird at the same time in the same oven, unless you cut the bird up and cook the legs and breast separately, in which case you can really get them done perfectly without too much trouble.
Was there any chapter that you found particularly difficult to research, or that you dreaded covering?
Not really. I would say that I'm maybe less of a fan of cookies than a lot of people in the world are, and so I didn't have quite as much to say about that subject as, and also there are some really wonderful books about baking that cover the technical aspects of cookies, but. For the most part, the reason I've stayed with the subject for almost 40 years is that I love it. I love almost everything about it, and I'm always learning.
Well, one of the things I do recall that you wrote about were specialty meats, and it sounded like you were not thinking that we should just automatically assume that they're better. And do you recall that chapter? And if so, how about if you explain what specialty meats are and what I was referring to as some of the things one needs to reconsider before jumping at them?
Well, these days we have all these wonderful choices. In the case of meat, you can get standard supermarket fare, or you can get grass-raised beef, or you can get organically produced meats. We do have lots of different options, and some of them, like local, organic, grass-fed, can be very expensive compared to the standard sort of mass-produced meats. And you might think that the lower production, more special meats are going to be better automatically because they're going to be 2 or 3 times as expensive. But that's not the case, and partly because they are so expensive. There's a lot less turnover in the meat case with those particular cuts, and so you really need to take a look with your own eyes at the piece of meat that you're thinking of buying and ask yourself, how long has it been sitting there? If it's 2 or 3 times as expensive, it may have been sitting there for 2 or 3 times as long, and that's not a good thing for the quality of the result.
Something sitting there long. You just reminded me, I remember growing up and being told, if you look at the produce, make sure that there aren't lights shining on it because the vitamins and nutritional value is depleted. Is that accurate? Do you know?
Actually, that turns out to be a really interesting and a little bit complicated subject. It's true that for many foods, light is deleterious. So things like dairy products, milk, it's much better to buy milk in opaque containers because the fluorescent lights in a dairy case are actually not very good for the milk. Cheese, same thing. But it turns out that in the case of produce, where the food is still alive, like broccoli, for example, because it's still alive, these plants depend on light for their energy, and if you deprive them of it altogether, they end up deteriorating faster than they would if you keep them in not bright lights or sunlight or anything like that, but give them some light, and they last longer.
What do you mean they're still alive? I mean, they've been cut from the stalk. Go ahead.
They have indeed been cut from the stalk, but the cells in the florets of broccoli or the leaf of collards or lettuce, they're still alive, and that's why things like that will keep better. For example, if you cut the stems and put them in a container of water, because that provides them again with one of the elements of life that they're slowly depleting since they've been cut off from the plant. So they are still alive, and treating them as such and remembering that that's the case can help you keep them better.
So then it isn't as simple as saying keep it out of light or protect it from light or give it light. It just depends on the product. And I forget, is all of that covered in your book?
Indeed, it is. And things like, for example, for the most part, it's better to keep things in the refrigerator at low temperatures because that slows down the metabolism of these products and helps them last longer, kind of puts them in the plant version of hibernation. But for some things, that's not the case, because if, for example, they've come from a tropical climate originally, cold temperatures are something that's going to damage their tissues rather than preserve them. And that's true, for example, of basil, which originally came from India and really does not like the cold at all. The leaves will turn black if you keep them in the refrigerator. It's also true of tomatoes. If you want to maintain the flavor of a ripe tomato, the worst thing you can do for it is put it in the refrigerator.
And cheese, too, doesn't do too well in the fridge, as I recall.
That's right. It's much better at room temperature.
You just mentioned water. Is water, the source of water, really exaggerated? Do we need to pay so much attention to that?
Well, I think it's a very good idea to know something about your water, because so much of cooking depends on it, either as a cooking medium for boiling or steaming, or as an ingredient. When we cook rice or pasta, we're essentially taking a dry food and adding our water to it, and so it's a major component in our cooking, and it's good to know something about the quality of the water. It can make a difference not just for the flavor, but also the way things cook, because hard water, for example, waters that are high in minerals, can actually make it much harder to cook legumes, for example, dried beans. They may never get soft if you have too much calcium in your water.
The book is Keys to Good Cooking, a guide to making the best of foods and recipes, a Penguin Press publication, and my guest this morning is its author, food scientist, I think I can call you that, Harold McGee. Would you like to correct me on that, or is that okay?
Well, it would be fine by me, except that there is a profession called food science where, you get credentials by going to school, and I have not done that. So I'm a food science writer rather than a food scientist.
Thank you. I'll try to remember that. You also mentioned that vegetables and herbs, their flavor is a warning and a weapon. I thought that was rather interesting.
Yeah, we think of herbs and spices as being these wonderful things that give us flavor, give foods that are otherwise a little bit bland some more interest. But if you ask the question, why do these particular plants have these particular flavors in them, and look at their ecology and their evolution, what you discover is that they're there primarily to deter animals from eating them, or to deter microbes from infecting them. And if you go, as I have, to the Mediterranean or to India to see where these things originated, in the case of the Mediterranean herbs, they're growing on these rocky limestone outcroppings with almost nothing else around. They're very good at growing in very dry conditions, and that means that they're really exposed. If a slug or a goat comes along, that's the only thing in sight, and so they're going to get eaten unless they find a way to protect themselves. Some things grow thorns, which are a kind of mechanical protection, but other things develop these very strong flavors. And if you do the experiment of just sticking a sprig of rosemary in your mouth and chewing on it straight, you'll realize that those flavors are there not to please us, but to irritate us. And the reason cooks can get wonderful flavors from them is that we use them in very, very tiny quantities. We dilute them into other foods and just get a hint of that aroma without any of the irritation.
Since we're talking about toxins, I recall reading and hearing about green potatoes, and you say just peel them. Well, then how toxic is that green, and how far down do you cut it? Well,
the most recent research on that has shown that we don't need to be as concerned about green potatoes as we thought we did. And that's true of alkaloids in the potato and tomato family in general. They're members of the same family. Tomato leaves have a similar kind of alkaloid in them. And for a long time it was thought that these were very toxic materials, and they are produced in potatoes when the potatoes are exposed to light. Of course, they're normally underground and not exposed to light, and when they are exposed to light, they produce this alkaloid. And it turns out that the alkaloid now seems to be not as toxic as we once thought, and we need to be less concerned about it, and rather than throwing the potato away, if we just peel it down to the point that we don't really see any more green, it's perfectly fine.
And yet grains are particularly notable for mold spores, and something you really caution us about.
That's right. Grains are a different story because a different thing is going on there. Instead of the plants protecting themselves with alkaloids, the grains get infected by molds, and these molds, some of them produce carcinogens as toxins, and so you really want to be very careful about that.
Speaking of carcinogens, I vaguely recall years ago reading about heating oil created acrylamides, was it, or polycyclic hydrocarbons? I forget. Do you know anything about that? Are you cautious about how much you heat an oil, skipping the idea that it's starting to smoke?
Yes. So oils develop, all kinds of things. The compounds that you mentioned are things that you tend to find more on carbohydrates. Acrylamides are produced when, for example, you deep fry potato chips, French fries, things like that. And then the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons are things that you find when you barbecue meats. And neither of them are good for you. That's very true. In the case of reusing frying oils, what you end up with are lots and lots of aldehydes. And these are also not especially good for us. And so ideally, we would use fresh oil every time we fried. Now, in the case of a fast food joint or restaurant that specializes in French fries or something like that, just for economy's sake, they're going to have to use oil repeatedly. But what you want to do is, if you walk into a place and it smells like old oil, then you really don't want to order something fried there, because that's an indication that the oils are pretty heavy in aldehydes, and that's not a good thing.
So you don't worry about keeping your oil at a low temperature when you're cooking? Because that was what I recall. There was the chemical change, and there was this fear factor there attached.
Well, no. If you the problem with cooking in oil at low temperatures is that the really wonderful and distinctive aromas and textures that make frying worthwhile in the first place don't develop at low temperatures. So you can confit foods at low temperatures in oil, which is kind of like poaching. process. But if you really want that distinctive flavor of frying, then you really need to cook it at 350, 375 degrees.
Which automatically points us in the direction of, if I remember correctly, you said there are a number of recipes that are on the verge of failure, and so they really have to be adhered to, and that was specifically regarding baked goods.
That's right, pastries in particular, because if you're making bread, you have a fair amount of leeway in the proportions of water and flour. But when it comes to pastries, where you're making something that's very dry and crisp and crumbly or flaky, you're adding barely enough water to hold the pastry together. And if you add a little bit more than that, you end up with something leathery rather than crisp. So there, the proportions really are very important.
I recall growing up hearing that wine, if you have bad wine, just let it sit out and it'll become vinegar. That's a fallacy, isn't it?
Well, it depends on what made it bad. So if the wine has started to go bad because it's been infected with the bacteria that make vinegar, then yes, you'll end up with vinegar. But oftentimes, wine is infected by other things, and one of the more common defects is something called a corked aroma, which develops from microbes that end up living in the cork of a bottle of wine and producing this smell that in very small quantities can really make a wine smell like a dank basement. It's a really unpleasant aroma. And for a long time it was thought that there was just nothing you could do about that. And it turns out that there is something that you can do, at least to remove the unpleasant aroma. It doesn't make it into a great wine, but if a wine that you open does smell like a dank basement, then what you can do is pour it into a bowl and then swish just a little sheet of plastic wrap in it. And it turns out that the molecule that makes that aroma is very similar in structure to polyethylene. And if you swish polyethylene around in the wine, it'll actually soak up that corked aroma and just remove it from the wine. And it takes maybe a minute to do that. It's very, very quick. Then you just take out the piece of plastic wrap, shake it off, pour the wine back into the bottle through a funnel, and you're ready to go.
I love it. I'm going to try that. Of course, the other part of that is that corked sometimes also just absorbs the smell of the wine, the fruit. I've been told, and so it's also when it's depleted of any kind of a scent, that could also be the same bacteria. Am I correct?
Well, what happens is that corked aroma ends up masking the pleasant flavors of the wine, so that there may still be some fruitiness. The molecules that create that perception of fruitiness may still be in the wine, but because the corked aroma is so strong, you just don't get a chance to enjoy it.
The book is Keys to Good Cooking, a guide to making the best of foods and recipes, a Penguin Press publication. My guest this morning is food science writer Harold Magee. I want to go back to vinegar because I had this long conversation with someone, and he said, well, he had to get a mother culture to inoculate the wine for the acidic acid to change it to vinegar. Yet I recall hearing if you left the wine out and the fruit flies got to it, they would automatically inoculate it. Incorrect or correct?
Well, that'll probably work 90% of the time, but it's not a guarantee the way using a mother is. So wine is turned into vinegar by a particular kind of bacterium, which, unlike most bacteria, can actually tolerate alcohol and, in fact, grows on alcohol and converts it to acetic acid. And those bacteria are floating around in the air all over the place, and they're found on insects as well as other things in our environment. And so it's usually true that if you leave the wine out long enough of those bacteria will get in there and start to grow that you'll end up with vinegar. But sometimes other bacteria or molds will begin to grow, and then you end up with something that's nasty instead. If you use a mother, then you are starting with a large population of exactly the bacteria that you want in there, and so that's why that gives you a guarantee.
And if I use a mother, how do I know how long to use it so it keeps that maximum of 5 to 8% acid? You're aiming for something in the neighborhood of 5 to 7%, and so there are a couple of things. One is that usually what you want to do is dilute the wine to some extent, because most wines are 12 to 14% alcohol. That's a little bit strong for acetic acid bacteria to grow happily, and so if you dilute it with about a third the volume in water, that'll make it a little more appealing to those bacteria. But then the other thing is that it's really hard to predict, given an unknown mother and a wine whose particular qualities are going to vary from bottle to bottle, and also temperature makes a big difference. And so there really isn't a good way to predict how long it's going to take to get to the right acetic acid level. So I actually have a couple of barrels of vinegar going all the time, and there's really no substitute for just checking. Siphon a little bit out and taste it and see what it's like. And if it tastes like you're expecting, like a bottled vinegar, then you're done. And if it's still more alcoholic than vinegary, then give it another few weeks. I want to veer away from your book for just a moment here, Keys to Good Cooking, a guide to making the best of foods and recipes. You're involved with a fascinating project, the modernistcuisine.com. That sounds great.
Yeah, it's a very exciting project, and in fact, I'm not really involved with it. I'm a kind of admirer from a distance.
Not a consultant or contributor?
Well, I did. I suppose I contributed a little bit in the way of background information for the history part of the project. But this is a man named Nathan Myhrvold, who is working up in Seattle with a team of about 10 other people. And they're putting together really a definitive, I think it's now up to 6 volumes, project publication that will come out this spring. And it's just a very comprehensive look at the science of cooking and modern techniques for getting the best out of ingredients. And they're very inventive people, very imaginative people, and also very serious about getting the facts just right. So I can't wait to see the whole thing.
Yeah, it's an amazing project. modernistcuisine.com, if anyone wants to look at that website. I just happened to have had someone point me in that direction. My guest this morning has been Harold Magee, again, author of Keys to Good Cooking, a guide to making the best of foods and recipes, a Penguin Press publication. Once again, it's been fascinating having you on. I've greatly appreciated it. A lot of information in the book, and a lot of it has to do with the different types of proteins, it seems. I thank you for the book. Would you like to give a website address or anything?
Yes, my website is curiouscook.com.
Curiouscook.com. Harold, thank you so much for joining us today on Pleasures and Taste.
Thank you, Wróbel.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
And again, next Tuesday, interviews begin at 8:45. Colin Max Roach, co-author of Japanese Swords. If you like swords, if you like cutlery, if you're interested in Japanese art, I personally am. In fact, I'll be hitting a museum later today in San Francisco for the Japanese prints. That is something you're going to want to pick up and certainly tune into, Japanese Swords. At 9:30 a.m. next Tuesday, Elise Pasquale, she's a foodie international person, decided to do something like 1,000 miles in 1 year. No, Something like that. 1,000 miles in a year, that sounds wrong. But 100 amazing meals. She's doing it in 1 year, and we'll find out how she's doing and what she's discovered. All of that next Tuesday with interviews beginning at 8:45. For now, just enjoy the pleasures in life. And thanks for listening.
I want to drink a toast with my friend here. My wonderful, loving friend who's helped me so much. You will take a glass with me, won't you, Baron?